This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not offered as legal or professional advice regarding any particular matter. No person should act on the basis of this presentation without seeking appropriate professional advice. The speaker's views expressed in this program may not be reflective of those of anyone else, including their respective firms or any of its lawyers, associates, or clients.
Welcome to Supercharged Supply Chain, a podcast that delves into the complex, complicated, and ever-changing world of getting product from a source to a destination with your hosts, Ron Liebman and Joseph Paris.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Supercharged Supply Chain with Joe Paris, who you see over there, and Ron Liebman. Today, we're going to talk about supply chain digitalization. Now, in a way, that's a coined term that covers many, many things just because it has some sort of digital technology. It can run from digitized brokerage to steamship lines now having visibility software, to AI and blockchain, to some degree, even autonomous technology, which we spoke about before. Today, we're going to try to center more on how this affects predictive analysis to avoid supply chain disruptions. And with that, to start that, I give you our expert, Joe.
Oh, I don't know about expert. I'm not really a bite head, if you will, but I'm pretty familiar with the application and the need for digitalization in the supply chain. And we've seen this, especially over the last year, as there's been some considerable disruption in the supply chain. Everything from tariffs to COVID to whatever. It's been very, very difficult to have a supply chain that is predictable. And at the end of the day, businesses thrive on stability and predictability. And, it scares the living bejesus out of them when they can't predict or their supply chain isn't reliable. So what I'm particularly seeing is the desire. I don't know how necessarily effective the solutions have been, but the desire to be able to predict disruptions in the supply chain before they occur. And in almost all cases, there are telltales. There are signs of a pending disruption. I mean, we see the chip manufacturers and the disruption to the automotive manufacturers presently, and how they're scrambling to make sure that they don't run out of chips and shut down their supply chain. So, was there a way of seeing that this was a threat before the threat manifested itself? And I think that's where supply chain needs to evolve towards, not just putting out blanket orders for the year or the next 2 years, but to actually manage and monitor whether or not those blanket orders are actually going to be fulfilled as promised and intended. And what are you seeing, Ron?
I'm seeing a run on any kind of technology that's digitized. Excuse me. Particularly if you look at investment, the kinds of technologies you're talking about, the kinds of technologies I opened with, are getting huge play from investors, and not only the high-flying cowboy VCs, but now we're seeing companies like Greenbrier, for example, PEs, sovereign wealth funds and such, looking to invest in these technologies. To some degree, you could say it's Las Vegas and just investing, hoping to hit on the next Google. But the fact of the matter is, there's this understanding that this is where the supply chain is going next. And supply chain, as much technology we have with WMS and TMS and any other S, still is behind many other industries in taking on and following the data that they can actually get. It's one thing to have it, it's nothing to use it. So I think with the continued push by people with wealth, companies to invest in these companies and develop and make better products and even integrative products across many different kinds of digital technology, I think that industry will become more comfortable with it. And I think there's sort of an age gap. I think as younger people begin to come into the industry more and more, growing up with one of these being their Bible, they're going to find it much easier to look at data in various different ways predictively and utilize it. Um, you know, working with a pen and pencil works okay. If in fact you do it every day, all the time, every minute, it's a lot easier if a system can pump out data to you and give you warnings and show you when something is happening in Sri Lanka that may affect your production in Mumbai.
Right.
And so that's what I think. I think it is there. I don't think it's there as much as the press likes to say it is. I think there's a lot of puffing, but it is there and it's only going to get better.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the puffing, for instance. What I see, it's not leading edge technology. Sometimes it's bleeding edge technology. And, people are acquiring the technology oftentimes in the hopes that the features promised will actually come to be. Or alternatively, senior leaders will buy the technology and believe that after the technology is bought, their job is done. And what they fail to realize is after they've acquired the technology, that's only the end of the beginning. They now have to implement, they have to test, they have to, bring on board the users. And I think there's a lot of, peril in being on the cutting edge if you become over-reliant on something that's not tried and true yet.
Well, you advise companies, particularly warehousing kinds of companies, in how to use this technology. You help them integrate it. Maybe you can give us an example of how you would use it or have used it in a particular situation.
Well, one of the big challenges that I see, and I'm a very pragmatic person. Maybe sometimes I'm overly pragmatic. Maybe some people might even say cynical. I don't know that would be true. I'm hopeful, but I'm also, got my 2 feet firmly on the ground, right? So when a technology offering is being proposed, I like to do the due diligence. I mean, what exactly is working and what is not working? What is promised in the next version, for instance? And if your business is being based on that next version, your business model, your aspirations are based on that next version, the feature set coming out in that next version, and it doesn't come out or it doesn't come out in time, you put your whole corporate strategy at risk. And, I've seen many, many times where people are enamored with the sexy user interface, but the meat behind the facade is not there. And so, what I would caution people, because I've seen it just far too many times, is to make sure that the decisions you're making on technology are based in a reality that is either here and now or very near term, and that the technology provider is committed to it contractually. Because otherwise, how many IT projects, Ron, have you ever seen that have failed? Right. And, millions have been invested and discarded. I mean, it just happens so often that you wonder why it continues to happen. Because by now, everybody should have been burned. So everybody should have, be a little bit more jaded when, the promises are made.
We're sort of being negative Nellies here, but I think another thing people have to look at that the typical logistician doesn't look at is that technology runs ahead of the law, significantly ahead of the law. And so there are questions in certain circumstances if you're going to use digital technology, particularly when you're looking at visibility kind of software.
Right.
You now know things. What do you do with those things you know?
Right.
Do you have a duty to tell someone if you see something that doesn't look right? And if you don't, what do you have any kind of liability?
Right.
There's no true answer to this. I'm sure plaintiffs' lawyers will give us the answer in the next 20 years, but that's really there. The law cannot change as quickly as folks in Silicon Valley can, or nowadays in Austin, Texas, or Miami. It just can't. So brilliant ideas often get harmed by the fact that they may have legal consequences, and that the most brilliant idea that everyone wants may turn out to give you liability your company can't afford.
Right.
And so I think you always have to do an analysis like that. And I'm not saying turn it into a legal project, but I think you always have to look at the legal aspects of anything new where there's no law covering that specific kind of product.
Right. I mean, it would be very easy to run afoul of GDPR, for instance, in the EU, collecting the data that you might be collecting. And, the United States is a little bit more footloose and fancy free when it comes to, harvesting data and using data. But that is not the case in the EU, where, the penalties are pretty nasty if you run afoul of it. So, there are ways of, being compliant and still harvesting the data you need. You just need permissions, the proper permissions documented that you're going to be harvesting this data and what its purpose is for, and that you're not going to share it with the entirety of the world. But you have to be cognizant of these rules and regs before you implement the technology. Otherwise, you might have a bad day.
Well, two interesting things. First, but no, us in America are moving towards GDPR. I mean, California has their own. Now, Virginia just passed theirs, and this country is moving to GDPR kind of data privacy rules. So, but because it's the US, it's going to take a while because it's pretty much going state by state.
Right.
But
Which I think that's a mistake, by the way. I mean, can you imagine 50 states each with their own GDPR? I mean, what ends up happening, Ron, this, is that people just ignore it.
And privacy lawyers make a lot of money. That's
Yeah,
what happens to, or
Yeah.
consultants. But let's take it out of the warehouse setting for a while, and let's look at it. I keep talking about visibility. Piece of visibility software that tells you how fast, how long, where something is, be it a truck or a plane or anything, tells you a lot. And looking at it in like a truck setting, what if you see a truck's going 100 miles an hour? It's pinging and pinging along, so you know where things are, so you're not out of stock. But you see a truck going 100 miles an hour. What do you do?
Right.
Well, some would say nothing. You're just looking at data. Others would say, is there a duty? What if, God forbid, that hits something or someone and causes major damage? That's ultimately going to be a binder on technology once it gets litigated, which I do not think it has yet. And then you take that out to the max in many different kinds of products. Again, not something we should stop for, something we should take into account. And if there are things, be it in any kind of technology, any kind of digitized technology that need changes to the law, we should make them.
Right. Yeah, I have a client right now who's, he's quite irritated because he has pretty good analytics on his supply chain. His client, his customer, had not heeded any of the warnings this person was, the vendor, in this case, my client, was telegraphing to the customer that we have to bring forward, the inventory, start stocking it, start inventorying it, because there's a real risk of, some of these critical components not being available.
Mm-hmm.
And, sure as heck, that all came true. And now, the client's line, his client's line is shut down for lack of a connector, a connector that costs, pennies. The entire production line is shut down because it's a proprietary connector. There's sole source, or how it is. I mean, you can't get it. You can't get it. And unfortunately, it's the automotive industry. So to introduce an ECN, an engineering change notice, to the apparatus, it's like moving a mountain, because the automotive manufacturer doesn't then want to have to track 2 revs of that part out in the field because it's got 2 different connectors. God forbid there's some sort of warranty issue or repair needed. Now we have to say, oh, that's not the one with the A connector, it's the one with the B connector. And, it was an avoidable problem. And, my client had the analytics in place to say, we think this is going to happen. You should probably authorize us to stockpile those parts. Otherwise, we run the risk of running out. And it wasn't heeded.
Well, to be very un-PC, I think, excuse me, stupid is as stupid does.
Yeah, that's.
And if you have this predictive ability, predictive technology, and you don't use it, It's sort of it's sort of like buying a Peloton and using it to, hang your wash on. I mean,
Yeah,
it's useless. You're not going to get in shape. And in the case of, digital and analytic software, you're not going to get your company in shape. So that's just an example of the fact of the matter that people have to work in concert with the
right,
software and understand it, and more than anything, want to use it,
right,
and then will trust it enough to listen to it. And I think to some degree, again, that'll come over time. I
right,
think I see it happening more and more. Certainly large corporations supposedly are doing it more and more, but still to the smaller company where, every penny is sort of the owner's profit. uh, Even if it's telling them push the inventory forward, if there's a cost factor that's coming out of their pocket, that may be the overriding factor to the
right.
data they're receiving.
Right. But, it's almost like the doctor giving us advice and we don't heed it, and saying that if you don't give up smoking or if you don't start exercising, you're going to have a heart attack. And then all of a sudden you have a heart attack, and it's like the doctor's like, telegraphing this for years. It shouldn't be a surprise,
Mhm.
but we don't do something about it. We don't heed that advice. And it's there's peril and doom that only awaits. And so I think that one of the keys here, if we're going to talk about digitalization, we have to also talk about improving, we'll call it the collaboration of the supply chain. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? If a vendor is telling a customer there's a potential problem, and we have, we can mitigate that risk, but this is what has to be done. The customer's got to listen. He's got to listen, because the supplier, their best interest is keeping of course, the customer happy, and keeping the production and the product flowing properly. And so I think that, we have to make sure that we improve the level of trust and collaboration, communication across the supply chain. Not just looking at it as a customer vendor relationship, but all part of the overarching value chain.
But again, until we get to a time when technology works on its own, which I don't think you're going to see certainly not in my lifetime, it- people, it's the people who are involved with it who are really the block
Right.
that really cause the kinks in the supply chain, because the data is going to say what it says. We're still going to need people to analyze it, and we're still going to need people to analyze it with an open mind. And as always, as I talk about always in supply chain, and the bean counters have to be willing to give up a shekel here and there.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know,
exactly right.
and as we've spoken about in several of these, and myriad articles and online conversations about it, you can go anywhere. The fact of the matter is, digitalization data only helps you if you're willing to listen to it, and if you're willing to say it is the data that you have is as important as the cost data your CFO is putting out.
Right.
If you're going to always override operational data with cost data, then you're not going to be any better off than you were before you had AI and predictive analysis.
Right, 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 right. So, what do you think the next big thing in digitalization is going to be in the supply chain?
I think AI is used very little.
I agree
I
with that.
think there's
I
a
agree with that.
I think there's a lot of talk about it, and it sounds real cool. And like every digital broker says they do it, and matter of fact, every law firm's moving towards it, like these big ones. But the reality is, it's more talked about than it is. It's to use an analogy. Joe, I'm a big believer in autonomous vehicles, and you hear so much about it, but it's such a microset of a microset in the transportation industry right now.
Right,
It's a big deal that everyone's doing testing in Texas. Okay, so Texas has some runs, and it's the same thing with AI. There's lots of products. There's lots of ways to use it. We still haven't come to real standards on how people would use it, and there still is not total buy-in. It's still, I think, more a push by people saying we have to have it because everyone says that's where we're going, than
right,
it is companies of any kind understanding how to use it. So I think
right,
as people understand it, as it becomes more ingrained in sort of our minds, I think AI is the thing that's going to push us forward.
right.
I think it's the most important technology in my mind, at least.
I think that it's also got to grow beyond tactical. Right now I see AI looking at various stimulations and routing a document or sending an alert to somebody. But what I'd like to see eventually is it start predicting worldwide events, these effects of supply chain worldwide events, like for instance what's going on in Myanmar right now.
Mhm.
Okay. If the AI could see that there is civil unrest in a country that might result in the overturning of a government, if it could see that that's a potential, and you could see that just based on Google search words.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? The spike in Google searches, that could alert, people in the supply chain that this is a risk coming out of Myanmar. If there is a coup, if there is a government overthrow, what might that effect have on my supply chain? And perhaps I have to give my plan B a call and bring them on alert. So these things I'd like to see happen is that not just we'll call it expediters of information, but predictors of events.
Well, I think it has to be integrative. I don't think being predictive is enough. I think that the AI will have to do its predicting and tie into sort of a digitized system that will then spew out alternatives
Right.
and say, okay, this is happening in Myanmar, which means what? Well, it doesn't
Right.
mean a lot for American companies because Myanmar is not a big producer of anything for us. It means a lot more to the Europeans. It means a lot more to the Chinese. So, everyone would have to have their own sort of end-to-end. I think you talk about end-to-end modeling a lot. An end-to-end model, which would be a steady state model. AI predicts a change, the model changes, and that's put in front of decision makers to make their decisions.
Right. But even in Myanmar, even if the U.S. doesn't have extensive trade with Myanmar, but they trade with China, then what out of China might we expect that has a dependency on Myanmar? So we have to look not just at the single level. We have to look, and we can't do this as human beings. There's just not enough people power in order to monitor the front page of the Wall Street Journal or whatever it is to understand what's going on in the world. We have to be able to have bots, out there looking for these threats and or opportunities. I don't want to just always be negative, right? There's also opportunities, and what that might have in our effects in our supply chain.
No, that's a very good point. But again, I don't think we're there for all, and that's why I call it puffing.
Yeah, we're
I,
not definitely.
I think, if this were to be a 5-phase project, we're in phase 0.9, and it'll continue and it'll certainly ratchet itself up pretty quickly.
Right.
Because, if you look at it now, it's ratcheted up. It's just that a lot of it isn't, in my mind, what it says it is yet.
Right.
But it's going, there's no question that's where the world is going. And so the other thing I'd like to mention is once you have AI, the one thing the world has to deal with, and this is something we've talked about several times, the world has to deal with how is that going to affect jobs?
Right.
Because there's lots of people working doing predictive analysis, and you're not going to be able to keep up with a computer. Computer is going to be, much better than I how quickly it does it, but the computer is going to be doing this in nanoseconds, whatever you're going to call them, and it's going to run 5 different analyses in a time a person can do none.
Right.
So,
right.
so
Especially as quantum computing comes online, right?
So again, we're talking about when we look at going to digitalization, what effect might that have on labor and jobs, and how do we deal with that socially?
Right. Excellent. Well, listen, Ron, I think that we've covered, quite a bit in today's show on digitalization in the supply chain, and I'm sure it's a topic that we will revisit in future episodes because it's a moving target and things are changing all the time in that world.
And it's what everyone wants to hear, Joe.
So, on behalf of Ron Liebman and myself, Joe Paris, I'd like to thank everyone for listening in to another episode of Supercharged Supply Chain.
Okay.
Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to another edition of Supercharged Supply Chain with your hosts, Ron Liebman and Joseph Paris.
This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not offered as legal or professional advice regarding any particular matter. No person should act on the basis of this presentation without seeking appropriate professional advice. The speaker's views expressed in this program may not be reflective of those of anyone else, including their respective firms or any of its lawyers, associates, or clients.